The pen, a lacquered black cylinder of German engineering, worth more than most men's monthly rent, felt unervingly light in Julian Vance's hand. It hovered a hair's breadth above the signature line, a line that represented the culmination of a decade of relentless, soul-crushing work. Below his 40th floor office window, the city was a sprawling circuit board of glittering lights, each one a life he could not comprehend, a connection he could not feel. The glass was cold against his forehead, a sterile barrier between his rarefied air and the world below. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the climate control system and the frantic pounding in his own chest. The deal was worth $42 billion. It was more than a merger. It was an act of conquest, the final, decisive move in a game of corporate chess he had started 10 years ago. It was revenge, served on a platter of leveraged assets and hostile takeovers. And it felt like nothing. His lawyer, a man whose face was a permanent mask of cautious optimism, cleared his throat softly. "Julian, everything is in order." Julian nodded, a barely perceptible motion. He drew his focus back to the paper, to the crisp, unforgiving black ink that awaited the stroke of his name. This was it, the end of Richard Sterling, the man who had stolen his company, his future, his fiancée, the man who had taught him the brutal lesson that trust was a currency for fools. Julian had rebuilt himself from the ashes of that betrayal, forging an empire of steel and silicon, his heart encased in the same cold, unyielding material. The heavy oak door to his office, designed to open with a silent, deferential swing, suddenly burst inward with a crash that echoed like a gunshot in the pristine silence. Both Julian and his lawyer flinched, spinning around. Framed in the doorway was a man who could not have been more out of place. He wore the simple gray uniform of the building's night shift maintenance crew. He was tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical labor, not boardroom battles. His face was etched with a desperate urgency, his chest heaving. It was Marcus Thorne, the janitor from the lower floors. Julian had seen him a handful of times, a fleeting figure polishing the marble floors long after the executives had gone home, always with a quiet dignity that seemed to defy his station. Security was already moving, two suited men appearing behind Marcus, hands reaching for his arms. "Sir, I'm sorry, he just ran past." But Marcus ignored them, his eyes locked on Julian, wide and pleading. He took a staggering step forward, raising a hand. "Don't sign it!" he yelled, his voice raw and loud, a profane disruption in the Cathedral of Commerce. "Don't sign the $42 billion deal." Julian froze. His lawyer's jaw went slack. The security guards grabbed Marcus's arms, but the janitor's gaze didn't waver. It was fixed on Julian, a look of such profound, unadulterated sincerity that it cut through the layers of cynicism Julian had spent years constructing. In that moment, the entire, glittering, empty world of Julian Vance came to a dead, silent halt. The pen remained suspended over the paper, a black teardrop of ink waiting to fall. "Hold on," Julian said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that stopped the security guards instantly. They loosened their grip on Marcus but remained tensed, ready to intervene. Julian stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked around the massive mahogany desk that served as his fortress. He stopped a few feet from Marcus, studying the man's face. There was no hint of madness, no glint of greed. There was only a terrifying earnestness. "You have 60 seconds to explain why I shouldn't have you thrown out of this building and charged with trespassing," Julian said, his tone as cold and polished as the floor Marcus cleaned each night. Marcus swallowed hard, catching his breath. I was cleaning the auxiliary conference room on the 38th floor. Sterling's team was in there. They thought the floor was empty." He glanced nervously at the lawyer, then back to Julian. "They were celebrating, laughing. I heard them. One of them, a man with a red tie, he was bragging." "Bragging about what?" Julian's voice was clipped. Every second wasted felt like an eternity. "He said the deal was a masterpiece of creative accounting. He said the core assets were hollowed out. that the patents were all tied up in litigation they knew they'd lose in 6 months. He said, and I remember the words, "Sir," he said, "Vance is so blinded by revenge he's buying a Trojan horse filled with debt." They were laughing about how you wouldn't see it until it was too late. Julian's lawyer scoffed, stepping forward. "Julian, this is absurd. Our due diligence team is the best in the business. We've been over their books for months. This is a disgruntled employee, a madman, a corporate espionage attempt. Are you lying to me, Mr. Thorne?" Julian asked, his eyes never leaving Marcus's. He saw the flicker of hurt in the man's expression, the tightening of his jaw. "No, sir," Marcus said, his voice dropping, gaining a new weight of conviction. "I'm not. I have a daughter, Maya. Everything I do to be a man she can look up to. A man who does the right thing even when it's hard. Even when it means risking his job." He gestured toward the contract on the desk. "I don't know much about deals like this, but I know what I heard, and it sounded like theft. It sounded like the kind of thing that hurts a lot of regular people down the line. People like me." The mention of his daughter was a strange, discordant note in the sterile symphony of the office. It was a word that belonged to a different world, a world of scraped knees and bedtime stories, a world Julian had long since walled off. He looked at Marcus Thorne, at the worn fabric of his uniform and the calluses on his hands, and he saw not a janitor, but a father. It was a role so alien to Julian's existence that it held a bizarre fascination. For 10 years, his world had been populated by sharks and sycophants. Every relationship was transactional, every kindness a calculated move. Marcus's desperate plea was the opposite. It was a selfless act of immense risk with no conceivable reward. Why? The question echoed in the silent space where Julian's trust used to be. He turned to his lawyer. "Postpone the signing. Tell them we have a last-minute query from our internal auditors. Make it sound routine." "Julian, you can't be serious," the lawyer protested, his face aghast. "This will spook them. We could lose everything." "If what he says is true," Julian said, his gaze returning to Marcus, "then we're about to lose everything anyway. Just do it, Robert." Robert, recognizing the finality in Julian's tone, retreated with the papers, muttering into his phone. Julian was alone with Marcus and the 2 silent guards. "What's your daughter's name again?" Julian asked. Marcus seemed taken aback by the question. "Maya," he repeated softly. "She's 9. "Go home to her, Mr. Thorne," Julian said. "I'll have my head of security take your full statement. Don't talk to anyone else about this. Your job is safe. For now." Marcus nodded, a wave of relief washing over his features. "Thank you, sir. I had to say something." As Marcus was escorted out, Julian walked back to his window. The city lights seemed different now, less like a conquest and more like a collection of fragile, interconnected lives. For the first time in a decade, a crack had appeared in his armor. A janitor with an honest face and a daughter named Maya had done what billions of dollars and an army of lawyers could not. He had made Julian Vance pause and wonder if there was still something left in the world to believe in. The next 48 hours were a blur of hushed phone calls and encrypted emails. Julian's most trusted internal audit team, a small, fiercely loyal group he'd assembled for just such occasions, descended upon the due diligence data with a new surgical mandate. They weren't looking for confirmation. They were looking for a ghost. By the second day, they found a wisp of smoke. It was a complex shell corporation in the Cayman Islands, linked to Sterling's company, which held the licensing rights to their flagship software patents. The initial due diligence had cleared it as standard international tax structuring. But under this new, more paranoid lens, Julian's team found that the ownership of the shell company was designed to become deliberately ambiguous 72 hours after a change of control in the parent company. In other words, 3 days after Julian's acquisition. The patents would effectively vanish into a legal black hole, leaving Julian with a worthless technology portfolio. It was a brilliant, venomous little trap. It wasn't proof of the widespread rot Marcus had described, but it was enough. It was the head of the snake. Julian canceled his afternoon meetings. He didn't summon Marcus to his office. That felt like a king summoning a commoner. Instead, he took the elevator down to the sub-basement, a place of humming generators and labyrinthine pipes he hadn't visited since the building was constructed. He found the maintenance office, a small, cluttered room that smelled of industrial cleaner and coffee. A supervisor pointed him toward a corner workshop. The workshop was Marcus's sanctuary. It was filled with discarded office furniture, broken lamps, and malfunctioning electronics, the building's mechanical detritus. In the center of the room, however, stood something magnificent. A towering grandfather clock, its dark cherrywood scarred and faded, its brass pendulum still. Marcus Thorne was bent over its exposed inner workings, a delicate pair of tweezers in his hand. His brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't seem like a janitor now. He looked like a watchmaker, a craftsman. "Mr. Thorne," Julian said from the doorway. Marcus looked up, startled, a tiny brass gear held in the tweezers. He quickly set it down on a clean cloth and wiped his hands on a rag. "Mr. Vance, sir. I didn't expect to see you down here." "You were right," Julian said simply, stepping into the room. His expensive leather shoes felt out of place on the oil-stained concrete floor. "We found something. A shell corporation designed to strip the company of its patent rights post-acquisition. It's enough to justify halting the deal indefinitely while we launch a full investigation." Marcus exhaled slowly, the tension visibly leaving his shoulders. He leaned back against the workbench. "I'm glad," he said. "I was so worried I'd made a mistake, that I'd cost you something." "You may have saved me everything," Julian admitted. The words felt foreign on his tongue. He looked around the workshop, his eyes landing on the clock. "What's this?" A small, sad smile touched Marcus's lips. "It's junk, mostly. They were going to throw it out. From the old law firm on the 27th floor when they remodeled. But I couldn't let them. It's a beautiful piece of machinery. Just broken." He ran a hand gently over the clock's wooden case. "My wife, Sarah, she loved things like this. Old things with stories. She used to say that anything that was made with care could be fixed with care." Julian felt an unexpected pang of something he couldn't name. He had spent his life discarding anything that was broken. Employees, deals, relationships. The idea of mending something, of patiently restoring it, was a concept he'd long since abandoned. "She passed away," Marcus said, his voice quiet, matter-of-fact, but laden with a grief that was clearly still near the surface. 4 years ago. Car accident. Maya was in the car with her. She walked away without a scratch, physically. But she hasn't spoken a word since." Julian stood motionless. The sterile, black-and-white world of his business dealings suddenly felt trivial, childish. Here was a man grappling with a real, profound tragedy, a wound that no amount of money could ever heal. "I was an apprentice furniture maker back then," Marcus continued, his gaze distant. "My own business was just starting to take off. But after Sarah was gone, I couldn't. The hours were too long, the pay too uncertain. Maya needed me. She needed stability. So I sold my tools, took this job. Good hours, steady paycheck. I'm always home to put her to bed." He looked at Julian, his eyes clear and direct. "That's why I couldn't just walk away when I heard those men, Mr. Vance. Sarah taught me that you have to stand for something. And now, I have to be the kind of man Maya can count on, even if she can't tell me so." The story settled in the quiet air of the workshop, a testament to a love and sacrifice Julian could barely fathom. He had sacrificed relationships for his company. Marcus had sacrificed his dream for his child. Julian felt a profound sense of shame, of hollowness. He had billions, but this man, this janitor in a basement workshop, was richer in a way Julian couldn't begin to calculate. "I'm sorry for your loss, Marcus," Julian said, and for the first time, he used the man's first name. The formality of Mr. Thorne suddenly seemed absurd. "Thank you, sir." "Julian. Call me Julian." He took a step closer to the clock, peering at the intricate web of gears and springs. "What's wrong with it?" "The escape wheel is bent, and a few of the teeth on the main gear are stripped. It's delicate work. Takes time. Patience." "I used to build ship models when I was a boy," Julian heard himself say. "Complex rigging, tiny parts. I had the patience for it then, before Richard Sterling had taught him that patience was a weakness, that only relentless aggression yielded results." An unspoken understanding passed between them. This broken clock, this relic from a bygone era, was more than just wood and brass. It was a project, common ground, a quiet place where two vastly different men could meet. Julian Vance, the ruthless CEO, stayed in that basement for another hour, not talking about business or billions, but about the delicate art of putting something broken back together. In the weeks that followed, a strange and unspoken routine began to form. Julian would find reasons to leave his penthouse office late in the evening, taking the silent elevator down to the humming solitude of the sub-basement. He'd bring coffee. At first, he just watched as Marcus worked on the clock, his large hands surprisingly nimble as they navigated the maze of machinery. He also started seeing Maya. She would often be sitting quietly on a stool in the corner of the workshop, a large sketchpad on her lap, waiting for her father to finish his shift. She was a small girl with enormous, soulful eyes that seemed to see everything. She never spoke, but she would occasionally look up at Julian, a flicker of curiosity in her gaze, before returning to her drawing. One evening, as Julian was watching Marcus delicately file a newly crafted gear tooth, Maya slid off her stool. She walked over to Julian, her small feet making no sound on the concrete floor, and held her sketchpad out to him. Julian looked down. On the page was a remarkably detailed drawing of a heart. But it wasn't a simple valentine. It was an anatomical heart, filled with gears and cogs like the inside of the grandfather clock. Several of the gears were cracked, and one of the mainsprings was snapped in two. Julian felt his breath catch in his throat. This silent child had looked at him and drawn a perfect schematic of his own soul. He looked from the drawing to her wide, knowing eyes, and for the first time since the betrayal, he felt truly seen. He knelt down to her level. "It's broken," he said softly, his voice a little hoarse. Maya simply nodded. Then, she took her crayon and drew a tiny picture of a man with glasses, Julian, and a bigger man in a gray uniform, Marcus, standing beside the heart, holding tiny wrenches and oil cans. A slow smile spread across Julian's face. It was a real smile, one that reached his eyes, a feeling so unfamiliar it was almost startling. "You think we can fix it?" Maya gave another solemn nod, then took her sketchpad and returned to her stool, as if the matter was settled. From that day on, Julian didn't just watch. He began to help. Marcus, sensing the shift, cleared a space for him at the workbench. He taught Julian how to clean the delicate parts without stripping the patina, how to measure the precise tension of a spring. They worked in comfortable silence, the only sounds the gentle scrape of a file, the soft click of metal on metal, and the distant hum of the building's circulatory system. In these quiet hours, the sterile boardroom on the 40th floor felt a million miles away. The world of hostile takeovers and stock valuations was a phantom limb, a part of him that was no longer truly there. His life had been a frantic, relentless climb to the top of a mountain, only to find the summit cold, barren, and utterly alone. Here, in this basement filled with the smell of sawdust and oil, surrounded by broken things waiting to be mended, he felt a warmth, a purpose, that his billions could not buy. He learned about Maya's favorite color, yellow, like sunflowers, about the funny way her mother used to sing off-key, about Marcus's dream of one day building a rocking chair from a single piece of reclaimed oak. And Marcus, in turn, learned about the Julian who existed before the empire. The young man who loved sailing, who could name every constellation in the night sky, who had once believed in things like partnership and forever. One night, while they were reassembling the clock's intricate pendulum mechanism, Julian finally spoke of the wound he'd carried for so long. "His name is Richard Sterling," Julian began, his voice low. "He wasn't just my business partner. He was my best friend. We built our first company from my garage. We were going to change the world." He paused, his hands stilling their work. "And I was engaged to a woman named Catherine. I thought she was the love of my life. It turned out, she and Richard were in love with the company's potential more than they were with me. He told Marcus everything. The way they had systematically pushed him out, using legal maneuvers he hadn't understood at the time. The final, brutal meeting where they revealed they had diluted his shares to worthlessness and were forcing him out of the company he had created. Catherine had been there, standing by Richard's side. She hadn't even been able to meet his eyes. That day, I promised myself 2 things, Julian said, his voice hardening with the memory. First, that I would never, ever trust anyone that completely again. And second, that one day I would become so powerful that I could crush Richard Sterling and everything he had built. This deal, this $42 billion acquisition, it wasn't about business. It was the fulfillment of that promise. It was my revenge. Marcus listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When Julian finished, he didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. He simply picked up a piece of soft flannel and began polishing the clock's brass pendulum bob. Revenge is a heavy thing to carry, Marcus said after a long silence. It's like trying to build something with a hammer that only knows how to break things. You might finish the job, but the whole thing will be filled with holes. The simple wisdom of his words struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. He had spent a decade wielding a hammer, and his life was, indeed, filled with holes. Just then, Julian's phone buzzed, a harsh intrusion from the world above. It was a notification from his legal team, a news alert. The headline was stark: Vance Industries halts Sterling Tech merger. CEO Julian Vance lacks confidence. Sources say Richard had leaked the story. The war had just begun. The media firestorm was immediate and brutal. Richard Sterling, a master of public relations, painted himself as the victim. He went on financial news networks, expressing his deep disappointment and hinting that Julian Vance was an erratic leader, a man who had lost his nerve. The narrative he spun was powerful. Julian, the legendary corporate raider, had gotten cold feet, jeopardizing a deal that would have created thousands of jobs. Vance Industries stock took a sharp hit. The board was panicking. Richard wasn't just fighting in the press. He began applying pressure behind the scenes. He called Julian's largest investors, spreading rumors about his mental state. He threatened a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit for breach of contract and reputational damage, a legal battle that could mire Julian's company in court for years. Julian felt the old instincts kick in, the cold, calculating fury, the desire to retaliate with overwhelming force. He could leak the information about the Shell Corporation, ruin Richard publicly. But he hesitated. Doing so would expose his source. It would inevitably lead back to the janitor who overheard a conversation. It would put Marcus and Maya directly in Richard's line of fire. One evening, as he was heading down to the workshop, his phone rang. It was a restricted number. He answered. "Julian, you're making a terrible mistake," Richard Sterling's voice said, slick and familiar. The sound of it was like acid in his ear. "The only mistake was ever trusting you, Richard," Julian replied, his voice flat. "Don't be sentimental. This is business. And you are about to blow the deal of a lifetime over nothing. My people tell me you've been spending a lot of time in the basement, talking to the help." There was a pause, laden with menace. "Big deals have a way of creating collateral damage, Julian. Unimportant people can get swept away. It would be a shame if some hard-working janitor got tangled up in all this. Wouldn't it? A single father, I hear. Things could get very difficult for a man like that." The threat was unmistakable. It wasn't a hot-headed outburst. It was a cold, strategic move. Richard knew Julian had a source, and he was putting a target on him. "Stay away from him, Richard," Julian growled. "Then sign the papers," Richard said smoothly. "Let's close this chapter and both walk away richer. This is what we do. This is who we are. Or are you going to let some nobody with a mop dictate the course of your entire empire?" Richard hung up. Julian stood frozen in the hallway, the phone clutched in his hand. The threat echoed in his mind. He was no longer just protecting his company. He was protecting Marcus and Maya. The stakes had shifted from financial to deeply personal. He had let these people into his life, and in doing so, he had made them vulnerable. The weight of that responsibility was heavier than any multi-billion-dollar deal. He continued down to the workshop, his face a grim mask. Marcus and Maya were there. The grandfather clock was almost fully assembled. Marcus was just setting the heavy pendulum in place, preparing to test its swing. Maya was drawing, a rare, small smile on her face. The scene was so peaceful, so far removed from the predatory world Richard Sterling inhabited, that it made Julian's heart ache. He couldn't let that world touch them. He had to end this. But how? The crisis came to a head 2 days later. Julian arrived at the office to find his head of security, a stern ex-federal agent named Harris, waiting for him with a grave expression. "We have a problem, sir," Harris said, closing the office door behind them. Building security found an unauthorized surveillance device in the main boardroom. It was hidden inside a power outlet. Julian's blood ran cold. "Richard, we believe so," Harris confirmed. "But that's not the immediate problem." They reviewed the security logs. "The only person who accessed the boardroom after hours last night, other than your executive staff, was a member of the night shift custodial team." Julian knew the name before Harris even said it. Marcus Thorne. "His access card was used at 2:17 a.m., Harris continued, laying a report on the desk. "Worse, when security discreetly searched his personal locker in the basement, they found this." He placed a small evidence bag on the report. Inside was a roll of cash, $5,000. "It looks like a classic case of corporate espionage. We have to assume everything discussed in that room has been compromised. The police have been notified. Mr. Thorne has been suspended, pending a full investigation." Julian stared at the bag of cash. It was a plant, a crude but brutally effective one. Richard hadn't just threatened Marcus. He had framed him. He had turned Julian's greatest asset, a man of unimpeachable integrity, into his greatest liability. Julian was now completely isolated. If he defended Marcus, he'd look like a fool protecting a corporate spy. If he abandoned him, he'd be betraying the only person who had shown him genuine loyalty. He was trapped. Richard had maneuvered him into a corner where every possible move was a losing one. He could sign the deal, which would mean letting Richard win, abandoning Marcus to his fate, and knowingly walking his own company into a financial disaster. Or he could continue to refuse, in which case Marcus would likely face criminal charges, and Julian's reputation would be shredded in a public scandal, accused of covering up for a spy to sabotage a major deal. He spent the day locked in his office, the city lights blurring into meaningless streaks outside his window. His lawyers advised him to cut Marcus loose immediately, to issue a statement condemning the espionage and to cooperate fully with the authorities. It was the logical, strategic move. It was the move the old Julian Vance would have made without a second's hesitation. Protect the company. Eliminate the weakness. Show no mercy. But he kept seeing Maya's drawing of the broken, clockwork heart. He kept hearing Marcus's quiet words. Revenge is a hammer that only knows how to break things. He had a choice to make. Not between two business strategies, but between two versions of himself. The man he had been for the last 10 years. A wealthy, powerful, and profoundly lonely king of a barren kingdom. Or the man he was starting to believe he could be. Someone who could fix what was broken, someone who could stand for something more than just a bottom line. Late that night, he called Richard Sterling. "I've made my decision," Julian said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I knew you'd see reason." Richard's voice oozed with smug triumph. "My lawyers will be at your office at 9 a.m. tomorrow with a fresh set of papers. Let's get this done." 9 a.m., Julian repeated. "Be there." He hung up the phone. Then he made another call, this one to Harris. "I need you to do something for me," he said. "And I need it done with absolute discretion." He laid out his plan. It was a massive gamble, a move that could either save everything or burn it all to the ground. For the first time in a decade, he was acting not on calculation but on faith. The boardroom at Vance Industries had been designed to intimidate. A long, dark table of polished obsidian sat under a single, dramatic spotlight. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, a reminder of the power wielded within these walls. At precisely 9 a.m., Richard Sterling swept in, flanked by his legal team. He was smiling, a predator who knew his prey was cornered. "Julian," he said, extending a hand, "a wise decision. For both of us." Julian ignored the offered hand. He gestured to the chairs. "Sit down, Richard." Julian's own lawyers were present, looking tense and uncertain. They had argued against this meeting, but Julian had been immovable. The contract, a thick stack of paper representing $42 billion of ambition and deceit, sat in the center of the table. A single, elegant pen lay beside it. Richard's team spread their documents out. The room was silent except for the rustle of paper. Richard leaned back in his chair, the picture of victorious ease. "Shall we?" he prompted, nodding toward the signature page. Julian didn't move. He looked directly at Richard, his gaze as cold and hard as the table between them. "Before I sign anything," he said, his voice resonating in the quiet room, "I have something for you." He slid a single, slim folder across the obsidian surface. It stopped directly in front of Richard. Confused, Richard opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a high-resolution satellite image of a shipping freighter in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. "I don't understand," Richard said, looking up. "Is this a joke?" "That ship is named the Wandering Star," Julian explained calmly. "It's registered in Panama. Its cargo hold is currently filled with the entire inventory of your flagship product, all of which was reported as destroyed in a warehouse fire last quarter for a handsome insurance payout. My source on the ship's crew, who is very well compensated, has already forwarded the cargo manifest and GPS logs to the SEC and a handful of investigative journalists. I believe the term for this is insurance fraud, on top of everything else." The color drained from Richard's face. His confident smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of disbelief and horror. "But that's not all," Julian continued, his voice relentless. He slid a second folder across the table. This one contained financial transfer records. These show a payment of $5,000, transferred 2 days ago from an untraceable account you control to the brother-in-law of your head of security. The same brother-in-law who, it turns out, has a significant gambling debt and was more than happy to explain how he was paid to plant a listening device and a roll of cash to frame an innocent man. Julian stood up, placing his hands flat on the table. He was no longer just a CEO. He was a man passing judgment. "You see, Richard, when you threatened Marcus Thorne, you made a critical error. You assumed I was still the man you betrayed 10 years ago, a man who valued money and revenge above all else. But that man is gone. You asked me if I was going to let a nobody with a mop dictate the course of my empire." He paused, letting the weight of his next words fill the room. "The answer is yes, because that nobody showed me what real value is. It's integrity. It's loyalty. It's doing the right thing, no matter the cost." He picked up the $42 billion contract, holding it for a moment. Then, with a deliberate, cathartic motion, he ripped it in half. Gasps filled the room. The two halves of the contract fluttered onto the table. "This deal is dead," Julian announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "My legal team will be cooperating fully with the federal investigation into your company, which, I'm told, is already underway. Security will now show you out." Richard Sterling sat frozen, his face ashen. His empire had crumbled in the space of 5 minutes. As security guards entered the room, he looked at Julian, his eyes filled with a new kind of hatred, the hatred of the utterly defeated. Julian met his gaze, but he felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction. The desire for revenge had been burned out of him, replaced by something clean and solid. He had chosen not to destroy his enemy, but to protect his friend. And in that choice he had finally, truly won. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. The story of Sterling Tech's colossal fraud dominated the news cycle. Richard Sterling was indicted, his company imploded, and his name became a byword for corporate greed. In contrast, Julian Vance was hailed as a visionary leader, a man of principle who had the courage to walk away from a bad deal, saving his company and his investors from disaster. His company's stock, after a brief dip, soared to an all-time high. He had gained more in reputation and true value by rejecting the deal than he ever would have by completing it. But Julian's first act after the boardroom confrontation wasn't to check the stock market or take calls from reporters. It was to go to the one place that now felt like home: the basement. He found Marcus in his small workshop, packing a cardboard box with his personal effects. He looked tired and defeated. Maya sat on her stool nearby, her sketchpad lying untouched in her lap, her eyes red-rimmed. "Marcus," Julian said softly from the doorway. Marcus looked up, and his expression was wary. "Mr. Vance, I heard. It's all over the building's news feed. I'm glad you didn't get cheated." "It was never about the money," Julian said, walking into the room. "I came to tell you that you've been fully exonerated. All charges are being dropped. Your name is cleared." A flicker of relief crossed Marcus's face, but it was quickly replaced by a weary resignation. "Thank you for believing me." He taped the box shut. "I guess I should finish up here. I understand I'm still fired." "No," Julian said firmly. "You're not. I want you to have your job back. In fact, I'm creating a new position for you. Head of Building Operations and Special Projects. You'd have your own team, a budget. You could fix everything in this entire skyscraper." Marcus looked at the offer, at the life of stability it represented. He shook his head slowly. "I appreciate that, Julian. I really do. But this place, it's not my dream. It was a port in a storm. My dream is still in a box of old tools in my closet. It smells like wood shavings and varnish." Julian nodded, a deep understanding passing between them. He had expected this. He had hoped for it. "I know," he said, "which is why I have a different offer." He pulled a set of documents from his jacket pocket and laid them on the workbench, next to the half-packed box. "These are the incorporation papers for a new business. It's called Thorne and Vance Custom Woodworks. I've already leased a space downtown. A beautiful old brick building with great natural light. I've put $5 million into the business account as a seed investment. I'll handle the books, the business end of things. All you have to do is what you were born to do. Build beautiful things." Marcus stared at the papers, his eyes wide with disbelief. He picked up the top page, his fingers tracing the logo. He looked at Julian, his throat working, unable to speak. "You saved my company, Marcus," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me. Let me do this. Let's build something together. Something real." As the two men stood there, a profound moment of connection hanging in the air, a tiny voice broke the silence. "You fixed it." They both turned. Maya was standing beside them, looking up at Julian. Her huge, expressive eyes were shining with unshed tears. She had spoken, her first words in 4 years. Julian felt a powerful wave of emotion wash over him, so intense it almost brought him to his knees. He knelt down in front of her. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Maya reached out a small hand and placed it on the grandfather clock, its pendulum now swinging in a slow, steady, rhythmic beat. Then she looked back at Julian, a radiant smile spreading across her face. "You fixed the broken things," she said, her voice clear as a bell. Marcus let out a choked sob and knelt beside Julian, pulling his daughter into a fierce hug. Over her shoulder, his eyes met Julian's, and in that look was a gratitude and a bond that transcended words. The three of them were there, in that dusty basement, a broken clock ticking steadily beside them, a new, unlikely family forged in an act of trust and healed by a child's profound truth. 1 year later, the scent of freshly cut cherry would fill the air of the sun-drenched workshop. The sign on the old brick building read Thorne and Vance Custom Woodworks, in elegant, hand-carved letters. Inside, the space was a harmonious blend of old-world craftsmanship and modern design. Finished pieces, elegant desks, intricate rocking chairs, and stunning dining tables were displayed like works of art. Julian Vance, dressed in worn jeans and a simple cotton shirt dusted with a fine layer of sawdust, was carefully sanding the edge of a tabletop. The lines of stress and cynicism that had been etched onto his face for a decade were gone, replaced by the calm focus of a man engaged in work he loved. He was no longer a king in a glass tower, but a partner, a creator. Across the workshop, Marcus was guiding a piece of oak through a band saw, his movements fluid and confident. He was in his element, his passion for the craft evident in every precise cut. He would often catch Julian's eye and they would share a smile, a silent acknowledgement of the incredible journey they had taken. Running between them, her laughter echoing off the high ceilings, was Maya. She was a different child now, vivacious, chatty, and full of light. Her selective mutism was a distant memory, her voice now one of the workshop's most cherished sounds. She carried a sketchpad, but now it was filled not with broken hearts, but with whimsical designs for children's furniture, her imagination as boundless as her father's skill. "I think the inlay on this one should be stars, Julian," she called out, holding up a drawing of a small bookshelf. "Because books are like little rockets to other worlds." Julian chuckled, his heart swelling with a kind of love he never knew existed. "That's a brilliant idea, Maya. We'll make it a whole constellation." Later that afternoon, the three of them worked together on a new project, a hope chest commissioned by a young couple. Marcus showed Maya how to safely use a handplane, his large hands guiding hers. Julian carefully applied the first coat of oil, bringing out the wood's deep, warm grain. They worked in easy synchronicity, a team united by a shared purpose. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shafts of light through the workshop's large windows, Julian stepped back and watched Marcus and Maya laughing together. He realized, with a clarity that was both peaceful and profound, that he had spent half his life chasing a distorted idea of wealth. He had thought it was measured in billions, in market share, in the defeat of his enemies. He had been wrong. True wealth was the feeling of sawdust in your hair and the scent of varnish on your hands. It was the steady, reliable rhythm of a restored clock. It was the sound of a child's laughter in a sunlit room. It was the quiet, unshakable bond forged with a man who had reminded him how to be good. He had walked away from a $42 billion deal, and in exchange he had received the entire world.